Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another episode of the Rapid Record Recap, and I haven't been not uploading, you've been not uploading, and today I wanted to do the October and November 2023 editions of the Rapid Record Recap because I haven't been uploading lately, so I missed both of them, and now it's almost 2024, it's the last week of December. I'm not doing too hot right now, not gonna lie. My emotional agony aside, there's been a lot of really great as well as really bad music that's come out over the course of the past couple of months that I've listened to but haven't gotten the chance to talk about in full on the channel. And by haven't gotten the chance to, I mean completely neglected to because I'm lazy. So, without further ado, here is the combined October and November 2023 editions of the Rapid Record Recap. Dorian Electra, Fanfare. This is the definition of a grower album for me, because I'm going to be totally honest, I wasn't that impressed with Fanfare when I first heard it, and I was actually going to review it when it first came out back in October, but then I realized I didn't have anything to say about it at the time, so I didn't, because I just wasn't into it. And, I mean, yeah, I just wasn't initially impressed with the synthetic tone that a lot of Fanfare takes up intentionally throughout its runtime. I generally kind of prefer a lot of the more raw and natural sounds found on some of the highlight albums that industrial music as an art form has produced throughout the year up to this point. That being said, this, again, record has certainly grown on me. I've really come to enjoy a good amount of the subtleties that are found within this record. I think it's a very well-crafted album. I mean, I think there are genuinely a lot of things to really like here. The sort of disturbed, distorted show tune kind of style of Puppet, as well as a lot of the hedonism that's generally on display here. That's the perfect mixture of obnoxious and charismatic, making for something that's way more charming than it probably should be in the end. I think it results in a record that's pretty successful overall, and even if it's not my favorite Dorian record, I still prefer Flamboyant. I do think that this is a solid listening experience, and I'm glad that Fanfare has grown on me and that I gave it time to kind of stick around within my own little musical listening world, because, yeah, it's a solid record, and I definitely have different opinions on it now than I did when it first dropped a couple months back. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Drake, For All the Dogs. Man, has this one been an interesting one to sit with for a while. Before I actually talk about this record, I just want to describe the actual impact that it had on me as a person on YouTube. When I listened to this album, I walked into it going, hey, I'm going to review this. It's going to be one of the biggest releases of all of 2023. I have to do a full-length video on it, like 20-minute long review discussing my thoughts on it. And then I listened to it several times, and then I realized that I did have enough thoughts to do that long of a video, but also that I didn't want to, because mental health reasons, basically. And I'm only half joking when I say that. I mean, really, this album is so ridiculously lackluster that it actually changed the way I approach making videos now. This was the definitive moment where I realized I just needed to do reviews on albums that interested me in one way or another, or that I was actually passionate about, either positively or negatively. Because I am positive about the fact that I do not care about this record, and I'm positive about the fact that it is a terrible record, but man, there's just nothing here. I mean, Drake's performances here are middling at best, and generally he has all of the personality as a stick roundabout, the kind of charisma that a Big Bang Theory character has, which is ironically the kind of show I imagine Drake watches, most likely. I think the worst tracks here are the ones where Drake kind of tries to get a little more intimate with the listener on songs like Bahama's Promises, for example, where he really just fails to even be remotely sensual or emotional in any particular way, and that style of delivery especially highlights some of his weaker lyrics like I'm auntie like your daddy's sister, and the surely soon-to-be immortal feel like I'm bi because you're one of the guys, girl. This guy has an obsession with just making references to the potential sexuality of women that he's interested in. I mean, between that and the girl you a lesbian Me Too bar from Certified Lover Boy, I don't know what this guy's deal is at this point. There's also his diss against Esperanza Spalding on the track Away From Home, who, for those not in the know, is the jazz artist who won Best Artist at the Grammys over him a decade ago. Like, man, I don't think there is a more petty artist in the history of mainstream music than Drake. Like, dude, let the jazz bassist go. It's been 10 years. Nobody cares anymore. The features here are pretty weak too, even when they come from artists who are, generally speaking, inarguably more consistent and generally better than Drake. I mean, Chief Keef on All the Parties just doesn't really bring anything to the table, and J. Cole's verse on First Person Shooter, where he says that him and Drake are kind of like the Spider-Man meme where they're pointing at each other. It's like, yeah, I'm sure that bar won't age poorly in 15 years when nobody knows what the fuck you're talking about. The instrumentals here are about as close as it comes to saving itself, and even then, that's not really saying much, as a lot of tracks here feel pretty underbaked overall. I mean, even the better songs here, like 8am and Charlotte, which is actually a pretty decent track overall, don't really feel particularly memorable into the regards of how they're structured or anything like that. They're just executed pretty well overall. Not really anything, good. Also, Drake rapping in Spanish on Gently is genuinely one of the funniest things he's ever done. Obviously not intentionally, I just think that might be the ultimate example of an artist learning part of a language they have otherwise no experience in for the sake of providing a shitty verse on one of their album's worst songs. Yeah, for all the dogs, there's just nothing here but ammunition for me to make fun of Drake. Otherwise, this is just a completely forgettable, unimportant album. I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5. The Deer Hunter, Migrant Returned. Migrant Returned is a re-recording of their unique but musically polarizing and, generally speaking, very much ignored 2012 record Migrant, which, I mean, that record's generally ignored for a pretty good reason. There's some pretty alright production here overall, but generally speaking, I think that a lot of this record only worsens, or at the very least, continues a lot of the negative qualities of the original Migrant from over a decade ago. I mean, the extended length on Migrant Returned leaves it feeling extremely bloated, and the original Migrant also felt bloated with a shorter runtime, so I don't necessarily know why an increase of that runtime was really a good idea in the eyes of the band. I mean, yes, I know it was supposed to expand upon the concepts and the many themes delivered throughout this record, but I think that just from a musical standpoint alone, you don't want to increase the length of a record that in the first place is already way too long. I mean, a lot of the instrumentals here just kind of sound like the stuff that you would get from an uninspired pop rock kind of track from the realms of 2000s progressive pop. I mean, sort of a weaker Coldplay B-side at times. I know that's harsh, but nonetheless, I stand my ground. And I especially can't stand some of the failed attempts at grandeur here with things like the horns on Middle Ground, for example. It just doesn't work out in the end. The thing about the original Migrant back in 2012 is that although I would not call that album good by any means at all, in fact, I can at least say that it was essential for the Deer Hunter as a band, because despite the fact that there were a lot of recurring themes there of helplessness and moving on from a series of negative events, etc., the original 2012 Migrant was the band's first non-conceptual album, and that's something that was very important for them then, and it continues to be important for them now. It allowed them to kind of break the mold and standards that they had set for themselves from the start by being a progressive rock band while still actually just performing songs that don't need some sort of connective level of lore to be appreciated by their fan base at large. That being said, that does not necessarily mean that it's worth remaking. The content on the original record is not great, and the same can be said here. There was just no need to re-record or even expand upon Migrant as a record, and that's really emphasized here by how a mediocre transitional release that's important to the band's discography was turned into something just outright bad. I'm going to give this record 2 stars out of 5. Hannah Diamond, Perfect Picture. God, I just really love some of the choruses and hooks here. I mean, songs like Poster Girl, come on, they're so catchy. How can you not like this album unless you're a cynical, emotionless, heartless person? I mean, I'm generally a couple of those things, and I like this, so I mean, a lot of the cool, glitchy kind of elements that are found in some of the sounds that Hannah really established herself with are still active here on Perfect Picture. That being said, it's the sheen and smoothness of it all that really just sells it. Beautiful production, and a record that is so squeaky clean, yet at the same time purely based on melody and emotion, that it all just kind of comes together and works out extremely well for both a pop album and for a current modern day album from Hannah Diamond after a decent but not particularly excellent debut album fairly long ago. I mean, not for nothing, but when she first came onto the scene in 2019 roundabout, or at the very least came onto my own radar, I was pretty excited for what she was going to do in the future, and then by the time the pandemic happened and whatnot, and the musical landscape was just wildly different by the end of it, I think that she kinda got left behind, as did a lot of other artists, and arguably as did hyperpop as a genre, at least within the more semi-mainstream conscience. That being said, Perfect Picture is a great way for her to continue her success and seemingly relevance as an artist. I mean, this thing is just pretty excellent overall, and lyrically, extremely uplifting too. By the end of this album, I was like, you know what, Hannah Diamond, you're right. I am unbreakable. And then by the time the album ended, I went back to, my depression coma. But, for what it's worth, this was pretty solid. Really, really liked it. I kind of loved it, actually. I mean, hey, it had to be pretty good. I mean, I am fragile, both emotionally and physically, and this thing gaslit me into believing in myself for 45 minutes. And that's pretty damn impressive. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. Lamp, Dusk to Dawn. Lamp is arguably one of the most well-loved Shibuya-kei projects out there, at least within music nerd circles, that's certainly true. And you know what, Dusk to Dawn absolutely shows why. I mean, the album does go on for maybe a bit too long, clocking in at roughly an hour and 15 minutes, just a touch bloated, generally speaking, and I'm not being sarcastic about that. Lamp can go on for a while and not get old, but there is enough sonic variation, enough of a sonic palette here, if you will, for the record to not really overstay its welcome per se either. I just wish that maybe a song or 2 or 3 or 4 were cut from its track list, but I digress. Super easy to digest album, great jazzy, loungy pop style, very fun record, very life-affirming record in a lot of ways, just a very upbeat, melodic, lovable album, huge amounts of personality, and basically, like everything else Lamp has ever done, which is just really, really, really strong, upbeat, good vibe pop music. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. Maybe there's a little bit wrong with an hour and 15 minutes of it, but generally speaking, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Ken Carson, A Great Chaos. Considering his last studio album, X, was ranked by me as one of the worst albums of 2022, I was kind of expecting his most recent output to kind of continue that trend. I don't think that that's necessarily a super crazy thing to expect, but I gotta say, although A Great Chaos is not a perfect record by any means, it is certainly a huge improvement over what he's done in the past. I mean, you've got some really nice instrumentals here, a lot of very cool atmospheric synths, some really hard-hitting 808s. It's definitely a step up. It's also probably the best album to come from Playboi Carti's Opium label up to this point. I mean, Destroy Lonely's features here are pretty weak, and there are a couple filler tracks like Overtime and Singapore. That being said, as a whole, Ken Carson really showing that he can actually put out some decent, solid material as an artist here. I'm genuinely really impressed, even if, again, I don't love the album. I think it's highly recommendable if you are into the Opium sound, and if that's the kind of style that you vibe with personally, I can see how a lot of people would consider this a masterpiece of a very specific niche within hip-hop right now. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Mike, Burning Desire. Mike has always been a consistently interesting artist, even on records that I don't personally click with all that much, and that's never been on display more than it is here on Burning Desire. I mean, the instrumentals are abstract, but they aren't overly minimalist either, and they really highlight his stream of consciousness style flow and lyrical style as well, not to mention the generally muddy and dark kind of atmosphere here that overall I think really combines to make something that, generally speaking, works out. I mean, I can't really describe it any other way, it just works. It may not be groundbreaking in the context of his catalog. I mean, Mike has done a lot of music with a somewhat similar tone to a lot of the tones in Burning Desire, but as a whole, I'm very impressed with this. I think that's a really solid record from him, and generally speaking, I can understand why he is considered one of the finest of the New York underground right now, because, I mean, he's consistently putting out one or more projects like this per year. I mean, come on, it's kind of hard to deny. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Metric, Formentera II. While I loved the first Formentera album last year, considered it one of the best indie pop / rock albums of the entirety of 2022, and generally saw it as a major comeback for Metric in terms of sheer quality, the follow-up kinda underwhelming in comparison, not gonna lie. Formentera II seems to want to continue the sort of late-night drive bittersweetness of its predecessor, but it lacks the slow burn quality that the first Formentera album had, and as such, a lot of the emotional impact here is lost. That being said, there still are some cuts here that do work in that regard. I mean, you have tracks like Go Ahead and Cry, for example, that I think definitely succeed at creating that sort of tone and atmosphere. It's just that there are a lot more misses than hits overall, and I just don't think it's nearly as consistent as the first Formentera album, and even the highlights here aren't as spectacular as those on the first Formentera album. Come on, Metric, I expected better from you, even though this is actually still pretty alright, just nowhere near as good as the first Formentera album. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Lorraine, I Killed Your Dog. This is a really nice album overall. As someone who wasn't a huge fan of her previous ambient-leaning material, I'm really happy to see her go in a more traditionally structured psychedelic pop / soul direction. I think it works out for the better overall, and it makes for what is easily the best release we've seen from Lorraine up to this point. I mean, sure, there are a couple of tracks that don't really stick with me melodically or conceptually like Need Be, but at the same time, her vocals are great, and a lot of the more off-kilter moments here on songs such as the title track really make this a very memorable listening experience overall, and I'm really happy to see her going in this direction. It's felt like she's had a lot of artistic potential for a while, and I Killed Your Dog maybe isn't the most definitive example of her utilizing her full potential, but at the same time, it's definitely a step in the absolutely right direction. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Offset, Set It Off. Offset's latest solo effort is probably his best lone effort to date overall. I mean, the guy's flow is really strong here, and most of the features from people like Young Nudy, Future, Travis Scott, etc. are all really solid. I do feel like some of the introspection that he goes for here and there could go a little bit deeper, and unfortunately the record does end off on a pretty weak and unimpressive note with the track Healthy, as that's far and away the most middling moment on the entire album, and it just so happens to close things out at the same time. That being said, still overall a decent record, one that I would recommend if you are a big Offset or Migos fan, or just a big fan of the current state of trap within the mainstream in general at the moment. And yeah, I think if anything, this proves that Offset is just as strong now as he was in the quote-unquote golden days of Migos, if you even really want to call them that. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. The Callous Daoboys. God smiles upon the Callous Daoboys. That God certainly does. 2022's Celebrity Therapist was a great sophomore effort from the Callous Daoboys, and it rightfully established them as one of the most hyped up mathcore bands at the moment, and as such, any sort of follow-up, be it LP or EP, immediately interested me, and well, in this case, it turned out to be an EP, God Smiles Upon the Callous Daoboys, and here they take a much more avant-garde direction, something even more rigid and left field than their previous efforts, and honestly, I kind of love it. I can see why this is a pretty polarizing one within their established fan base, because, well, they take up some of their more metalcore influences here, and for those who aren't really in the loop, metalcore, not the most consistently beloved genre across the metal and punk communities as a whole, but I digress. Personally, I think it's excellent. I really love the dissonant riffing you have on tracks like Pushing the Pink Envelope and my personal highlight, Waco Jesus, and they just bounce around with blistering speed, but also these highly technical styles and compositions that I think manages to both be impressive from a place of passion and from a place of actual structure. More than that, I love how they just completely jump outside of their comfort zone at random, and that's not just going into another subgenre within metal or hardcore or anything like that. I mean, one second it's just a regular kind of metalcore, mathcore track, and then the next second it's going into sort of samba, jazz fusion, lounge music, and then after that it's bouncing into hardcore breakbeat kind of style electronic. It's something that I find weirdly impressive, and despite the fact that it should come across as disjointed logically, it just doesn't. It all kind of works, and if anything, beautifully highlights the pure creativity of this band and how far they potentially will go in the future with this constant mishmash of influences and styles that they fully embrace wholeheartedly. So yeah, God Smiles Upon the Callous Daoboys EP. It's ridiculously fun, it's creative, it's raw and high energy, and honestly I just can't wait to see what the band do next in full-length LP form. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. Reverend Kristin Michael Hayter, Saved. I don't really have strong opinions about this record, at least not quite as strong as some people out there, and at the same time, I absolutely love this record, which is something that you could honestly kind of say about Reverend Kristin Michael Hayter's work as Lingua Ignota a couple years back. I mean, really, she is the definition of an artist that I have no clue how to feel about, yet absolutely adore all the same. At this record's core, however, I really enjoy the execution of it. The recycling of classic gospel tunes and hymns for the sake of creating this oppressive Southern Gothic sort of feel is one that pays off in dividends in regards to artistic choices, and the original compositions here just blend in perfectly overall. I mean, Saved may not provide me this sort of post-apocalyptic devastation in the same way that a record like Caligula or Sinner Get Ready does. It's not that biblical fire and brimstone annihilation that those albums gave me personally. That being said, Saved is kind of its own beast entirely and feels much more ambient despite not being an ambient record in any way. It's just something that really lingers. It just kind of consistently haunts the listener, and although that doesn't quite have the same punch that I personally enjoy, I can hugely appreciate that quality about the album, as well as how it distances itself from Kristin Michael Hayter's work with her previous pseudonym. So, yeah, as a whole, I really like this album, and I think it's freaky, I think it's interesting, I think it's creatively bold, and I think it's well worth a spin. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Taylor Swift, 1989, Taylor's version. This Taylor's version of 1989 is really disappointing, considering the average experience that I've personally had with previous Taylor's version albums have been pretty positive overall, especially the Taylor's version of Red, a record that I think far and away exceeded the quality of the original album, and I was really hoping that 1989 Taylor's version would pull off the same feat, but alas, it doesn't at all. In fact, it is pretty far from making that mark. A lot of the instrumentals here are just sterile electronic pop that has zero memorability factor whatsoever, and to turn some of the more memorable tracks from the original, like Blank Space and I Wish You Would, into just this modern pop mush that has no real flavor or personality. I mean, say what you will about 1989 era Taylor Swift, but at least she had charisma about her. She had a vibe about her, and as she gets bigger and bigger every year, it seems like she just becomes like less and less of a noteworthy figure despite being arguably the biggest musician on the planet. It's kind of impressive in a bad way how she just continues to get less and less personality with each passing release, seemingly. This is just a complete bastardization of a record that I think genuinely should be considered a pop classic of the modern era, kind of ish. Oh, there's also the newly added tracks from the Vault, too. Suburban Legends is okay, I guess. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. DJ Shadow, Action Adventure. You could say there's a bit of a running joke within the music obsessive community at large that DJ Shadow, despite being a beloved figure within producer circles, has never done anything even remotely of note after his classic 1996 album Introducing. And, I mean, yeah, it's a running joke, but, I mean, it's pretty true as well, sadly. I mean, I do think the guy has put out some solid material since 1996. I feel like it's almost hard to consistently miss that much over the course of multiple decades. That being said, it's also not necessarily hard to see why nothing has reached that same iconic status that Introducing did and continues to maintain to this very day. Because Action Adventure is just a whole lot of nothing, really. I mean, Action Adventure isn't outright bad, it just feels like a collection of completely unassuming royalty-free bits and pieces of electronic instrumentation, with the occasional neat sample thrown in there. I mean, it's just fine, but at the same time it's not, because it's just completely indistinct, especially coming from a producer who is, again, from one album alone, an absolute legend within so many different communities. It's just a shame to see what he's come to at this point, even if there are a couple of alright tracks here like Reflecting Pool. I hate to say it, I hate to quote Lars Ulrich of Metallica fame, but it's stock. It's just stock. There's nothing here. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Poppy, Zig. After her excellent cover of Kitty's Spit earlier this year, I was really hoping for a poppy alt-metal or new metal album, and instead we got this, which is significantly more underwhelming. This is just a pretty middling collection of pop songs that range from experimental to more traditional contemporary alternative pop. I mean, the instrumentals on a couple of tracks like One's Nose are pretty interesting, I guess, with that track having some more industrial tones to it overall that I can at least slightly appreciate, even if I don't think they're applied in a way that feels particularly unique within the current experimental pop landscape. But as a whole, most of this record just doesn't do anything remarkable, and that's a shame because Poppy is, generally speaking, a pretty remarkable musician. The album starts off decently with the pure raw energy of the track Church Outfit, and it ends off pretty well too with the semi-hyperpop vibes of Prove It, but what really matters is everything in between, and everything in between is just completely dull. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Kevin Abstract, Blanket. The downfall of Brockhampton as a collective is an awkward, messy, complicated story that people generally kind of make, YouTube video essays on, so I'm not even going to remotely touch on that here. I'm not going to try and retell it or anything, but I will tell you what I think of Kevin Abstract's first post-Brockhampton solo record, and, not feeling it, man. Not feeling it. And you know what, maybe I can't convey the entire Brockhampton story here. I mean, that's not even a maybe, that's a definite if I'm being honest with myself. But I can convey one thing, and that's that Kevin Abstract is far and away the most hyped up member of his old group, and he already had a couple of fairly well-received artsy experimental R&B records under his belt by the time Blanket came out. So, there was a lot of anticipation for this, and honestly, a fair amount of expectation as well. I mean, the guy has proven himself in the past, and even if I'm not a huge fan of his other solo work, a lot of people are, and this is different from those past solo releases, I'll give him that. I mean, Blanket is supposed to represent a new era for Kevin Abstract, and it does exactly that. It's just that what it represents isn't particularly good, as he uses this record to kind of veer into more of an indie pop, indie rock direction, and it just falls flat on its face a lot of the time. I mean, he's no stranger to experimentation, but the mousy vocals on here that are lacking in any real definitive emotion, the complete and total lack of structure in terms of having any memorable choruses or hooks or passages in general. It's kind of baffling that this album turned out to be as forgettable as it is. I mean, if Kevin Abstract is one thing, forgettable is, I mean, generally speaking, not it, but maybe this album's proving to be otherwise. The lyrical content here is just completely mediocre. I wouldn't really say it leans towards good or bad, just straight down the middle nothingness, and there's no real atmosphere here either. I think that he's trying to go for something semi-bittersweet, but I don't get that from the album, so I can't even really confidently say that that's what's being attempted on Blanket. It's just a record that doesn't manage to achieve any of the goals that it sets out to achieve, and even features from the extraordinarily talented Kara Jackson and MJ Lenderman on the song My Friend can't save it. I mean, even then, that's just a wildly unmemorable song. I'm going to give this record 2 stars out of 5. Spiritbox, The Fear of Fear. This is the latest EP from Spiritbox after their pretty unremarkable debut album in 2021, Eternal Blue, and I have to say that this really does feel like Spiritbox finally managing to find themselves in terms of their artistic voices within the realm of metal right now, and it's kind of a beautiful thing to see because this is a fantastic EP. Courtney LaPlante's vocals are excellent and go between soaring and guttural with ease, along with there being some strong guitar work from Mike Stringer. I really like the sort of gent complexities that they bring in here in terms of rhythms and time signatures, and yeah, overall this is just a really good metalcore EP, probably one of the best that the genre has to offer this year. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. YoungBoy Never Broke Again, Decided to. It's another YoungBoy album. He has almost 20 million Spotify listeners. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. PinkPantheress, Heaven Knows. This is the long-awaited debut studio album from PinkPantheress, arguably one of the most hyped-up solo artists on the planet at the moment, and, you know, Heaven Knows nicely follows up her 2021 mixtape, To Hell With It, via a series of nocturnal pop R&B fusion tracks with some cool electronic influences, primarily within the drum and bass field, to boot. I think it's a very unique record within the mainstream world of pop right now, and I really hope that she continues to have success in her field, because PinkPantheress is probably one of the most striking and charismatic figures within the sort of Billboard chart territory at the moment. I would give this album 5 stars out of 5, but there is a Central C verse on Nice to Meet You, so I'm going to have to dock it half a star, and I would then give it 4.5 stars out of 5, but this album did remind me of Central C's existence, so I'm going to have to dock it another full star, so I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Chris Stapleton, Higher. Chris Stapleton is a modern country legend, and I don't really think anybody would argue with that, especially if you are aware of how country as a genre is generally received critically at this point. I mean, for every dude like Jason Isbell, Chris Stapleton, or even Zach Bryan, it seems like you've had 100 Morgan Wallen types over the course of the past 5 to 10 years within the genre's popular scene. So, you know, Chris Stapleton, there's a lot to expect from him, and records like Starting Over are genuinely brilliant and have shown why he's creating such a legacy for himself at this point. That being said, Higher, not good. I mean, the songwriting here is just pretty forgettable, honestly, and that's a major appeal of Stapleton as an artist, but here he just doesn't feel particularly heartfelt. He doesn't feel particularly introspective, as some of his previous works have shown. And I mean, you do have some stronger tracks here. I like South Dakota as well as the title track. However, his voice, although just as excellent as ever, doesn't really see him going in any adventurous directions. And I mean, that's not to say that he has to perform in a way that's differentiated from what he's used to. But with that being said, when you're delivering so-so lyricism and instrumentals that are so unremarkable that I'm not even going to bring them up, I would hope that you would do something to make the album stand out slightly within country as a genre right now, and he just unfortunately doesn't, and I'm almost kind of wondering if this is going to be the start of the downfall of Chris Stapleton's relevance as a whole. Not to say this record's horrible, and I'm not saying this is any sort of Todd in the Shadows train record or anything, but at the same time, I mean, we got a lot of huge stars coming out of country music right now. Country music is the current pop, you know, and I don't know, this album just doesn't do anything to make a mainstream audience want to listen to more Chris Stapleton. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Rick Ross and Meek Mill, Too Good to Be True. I feel like a few years ago this would have been a huge deal, and you know what, it's not a few years ago now. It's 2023 now, and Rick Ross and Meek Mill, while by no means obscure, are pretty much inarguably well past their respective primes, at least in terms of their relevance within the larger cultural zeitgeist, and it certainly shows here. I mean, Rick Ross is fine, I guess, though noticeably not at all enthused or having any desire to be on this album whatsoever. The guy sounds bored as hell. Meek Mill seems a little more engaged with the material here, mainly on tracks like Above the Law, where he actually does deliver a couple of solid verses, but that's not really saying much when the guy you're paired with is an incredibly uninterested Rick Ross. That's not particularly a great feat. It's kind of like saying that you seemed way more excited than that piece of wet cardboard sitting in the corner. Most of Too Good to Be True is just kind of mediocre, if I'm being totally honest. I mean, it's not necessarily a horrible record, but both of the primary MCs here don't have much to say or do that really sticks out to me personally. And I think the worst moments come when they try to put forth those kind of hype beast sort of tracks, like for example Millionaire Now with French Montana, which was doomed from the start because it features French Montana. But the worst part of it all is that despite it being this really anthemic kind of song, none of them feel all that hype. It's kind of like them trying to make an anthem for people that, like, are neither here nor there, but at the same time want to seem like they really care, and I don't mean that in a good way either. More like too mid to be good. No one's made that joke before. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Kodak Black, When I Was Dead. It's Kodak Black's second and final album of 2023, guys. You know, Kodak Black, that guy that everybody definitely still cares about. And you know what? When I Was Dead is pretty much an improvement over his first record of the year, Pistols and Pearls, though honestly, considering that album was pretty terrible, that's not really saying a lot. I won't knock on his pen game too hard, generally speaking, because Kodak is more about vibes than he is lyrics, at least 9 times out of 10. But When I Was Dead usually tries to get a little introspective with things, a little more serious, and then you realize that Kodak Black is not capable of doing that at all. I mean, you have some outright depressing cuts here, like Close to Me, that conceptually are very sad songs, but they are so hard to take seriously when they have lyrics as mediocre as been living on the edge, can't let no one get close to me. Like, wow, you're really putting a lot of thought into the depth of your emotions there. I mean, no one's ever used the phrase living close to the edge to describe a rambunctious lifestyle. No one's ever done that. This record's so unique. Kodak just doesn't have anything going for him that sets him apart from the crowd. I mean, his instrumentals, just none of it really does anything that remotely makes him an interesting figure. And again, it is unfortunately kind of hard to take him seriously when he's seemingly incapable of writing anything of even remote worthiness of discussion. I'm going to give this record 2 stars out of 5. Kurt Vile, Back to Moon Beach. Kurt Vile's label Verse called this an EP by no one's definition but Kurt Vile's, and yeah, that sounds about right, considering it clocks in at barely under an hour. Even still, the guitar work on tracks like Wounded Bird Trying to Fly is excellent, and the songwriting on cuts like Tom Petty's Gone is wonderful in the same awkward, melancholy kind of way that perfectly haunts a lot of Kurt's music, generally speaking. It's something that's stuck around with him over the years. And, I mean, here with this slow burn, mellow kind of vibe, this very out in the woods, relaxing, yet still ever so slightly emotionally painful kind of tone, it all kind of plays to his strengths, I would say. Even the extremely off-kilter Christmas song Must Be Santa fits here, despite conceptually not working at all, seeing as this is an otherwise completely non-festive EP. But, I mean, hey, then again, if one of the greatest Christmas songs of all time, Fairy Tale of New York, can be on If I Should Fall from Grace with God by the Pogues, a completely non-Christmassy album, and work there, then, you know what, the same thing can happen here for Kurt Vile in 2023, okay? This is great material from one of the most beloved, consistent people within the general singer-songwriter realm of indie and alt right now, and it's not hard to see why he's such a highly regarded figure. He's just consistently excellent, and this is no different. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. Andre 3000, New Blue Sun. Blockhead, The Aux. Seeing the ever underrated Blockhead returning to producer albums for the first time since Free Sweatpants in 2019 is a really nice thing to see, considering he mainly focuses in on full-time collaborations with other artists, most notably Aesop Rock, as well as entirely instrumental records, and full-on producer albums with loads of features are somewhat rare for him at this point, and I have to say that The Aux is the best example of him doing this to date. This is basically a who's who of the best of the underground of rap. I mean, really, having Billy Woods, Aesop Rock, RXK Nephew, Open Mike Eagle, Koreatown Oddity, Quell Chris, Navy Blue, and Danny Brown all on the same record, when you consider how beloved all of their respective solo discographies are and how important all of them are in telling the story of modern hip-hop in general, it's kind of insane that they're all on the same record, and I'm shocked that this album has not been a bigger deal within music nerd circles at large. I mean, there's something here for everybody if you are interested in the bass genre at hand. There isn't a single standout verse here, but that's really only because every verse here is excellent, and generally speaking, Blockhead's very cold, jazz-tinged instrumentals fit the artist that he is hand-selected to be featured here, and for the few that wouldn't necessarily mesh with that kind of sound, like RXK Nephew, Blockhead steps outside of his comfort zone and goes in more lush or otherwise different directions for himself as a producer, and I can greatly admire that. There are a few things I would personally change here. I think that Now That's What I Call a Posse Cut Volume 56 doesn't have enough people on it, especially when you consider that there are so many legendary or legends in the making rappers on this record that it only features a handful of them. It's kind of disappointing, especially when it's so heavily focused on the whole Bruiser Brigade kind of movement with Danny Brown and Bruiser Wolf, but nonetheless, it's still a solid cut. I just wish more was done with it. And there are a couple of songs here, like God is Busy and Ponzu Sauce, which are back-to-back, that I feel are a bit expendable overall and could cut down the runtime a touch. But as a whole, those are fairly minor flaws when you consider this record as a whole and all of the positive qualities it brings to the table. The Aux is an incredibly impressive producer album, and I really hope that Blockhead continues to go in this direction in the future, because seeing the kinds of connections that he so obviously has on this record, it's wonderful. You know, it's really, really lovely to see all of these different artists coming together. I can't think of any less dorky ways to describe this album, but, you know, really, it's absolutely excellent. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that has been the Rapid Record recap for October and November of 2023. And yes, this happened in late December of 2023, but do I care? Yeah, a lot actually. because I still have a lot more filming to do to catch up with myself because of my own failure to upload. But that's besides the point. That's besides the point. Forget about that. Forget about that and just take in the fact that I talked about a lot of albums here, most of which people have already listened to or at least are aware of, and this video was made entirely for my own self-comfort rather than trying to turn people on to new music. That's something, I think. And with that being said, that is the end of the Rapid Record Recap. I have been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.